Good evening, everyone. I'm David Rubin, the Brown Foundation Curator of Contemporary Art, and welcome to our ongoing series of artist conversations. Tonight's guest is Trish Simonite. We're so glad to have you here, Trish.
Thanks.
Before we begin, just a reminder to please silence your cell phones, and I want to thank the sponsor of this evening's conversation, Susan Toomey Frost. Susan, thank you so much. A few brief announcements. The Missing Piece exhibition continues to be on view. It will be on view through July 31st. So if you want to spend more time in the show and know people who haven't seen it, please encourage them to do so. And don't forget, we have a mobile phone application that provides a virtual tour and allows you to participate in the Monitor Peace Project, where you can send your own images of peace and text messages of peace. And they'll play on the monitors in the Great Hall and also on our website. And you can also send the images through and text messages through the SAMA website. Some dates to remember. 2 weeks from tonight, I'll be doing an artist conversation with Gary Sweeney. And if you haven't picked up the flyer on the table, we are also having a special fundraising dinner honoring Gary following the conversation. I hope you'll consider joining us for that. On August 2nd at 6 p.m., I'll be doing a short Curator's Choice talk. These are the short talks that we curators alternate each month. And I'll be talking about contemporary artists responding to tragedy. In the contemporary galleries, you can see a work by Luis Cruz Aceta that was a response to the Oklahoma City bombings, and a work by Missy Smith, a response to Hurricanes Katrina and Rita. So that will be my topic at 6 p.m. on August 2nd. On September 2nd, we open the next Photo Septiembre exhibition at SAMA. It's called Animal Instinct, the photographs of Daniel Lee. He's a Taiwanese artist living in New York City, and he creates the most compelling images that are hybrids of human beings and animals. That opens September 2nd. On September 6th, I'll be leading Daniel Lee in an artist conversation, so I hope you'll consider attending those events. But tonight, we're going to learn all about Trish Simonite, her life, her art, and we're going to start, I guess, by taking a look at where you were born, Norwich, England. You want to tell us
Norwich, England, in Norfolk County, or the region called East Anglia, and it's about 100 miles northeast of London. I grew up in a small town called Attleborough.
Let's look at some of your early family photos, and maybe you can tell us a little bit about your early life.
On the top left, there's a photograph of my dad and I when I was tiny, probably taken down along the coast. Norfolk is surrounded by the North Sea. It's kind of across, it's the big bump above the Thames across from Denmark. And so we spent every summer at the coast growing up. And that landscape of Norfolk's been very influential for me.
Can you tell us about your parents?
My parents, my dad went to university and was a classic scholar, ancient Greek and Latin. And when he married my mom, he was in the army, and he was billeted to Norfolk. And he has a funny story. He was told to get off the train at a place that was spelled Wymondham. And when they announced at the train stop, Wyndham, which is how you pronounce it in Norfolk, he missed his stop. And but he ended up in Norfolk, fell in love with my mom, and went into my mother's father's family business, which was Massey Ferguson Agricultural Engineering firm. They sold tractors and combines and did repairs. Norfolk is very rural.
As we'll see in some of your work. And then, of course, your teen years eventually brought you to Texas there, but...
It was the 60s.
Yes, tell us about your 60s. Are you experienced? Tell us about your 60s experience.
It was London in the 60s when, and I met Richard in England.
Was there a Beatle craze to the degree that there was here?
Oh,
Beatles?
yes, there was
Yeah.
definitely. I had all the Beatles records.
Yeah.
I used to listen to Radio Caroline, the offshore pirate radio. They did a pirate radio movie that some people may have seen that was about that. And I used to listen to Bob Dylan and all of the music, and I was always wanting to be the first one to have the records. And
Were you taking pictures yet?
not yet, but in my elementary school, we had art history classes, and I've kept the books. We studied a painter each semester, and we also had great painting teachers who were really influential. My first teacher was Mr. Griffith, and he lost a finger in the war, and he used to paint with his thumb and his fourth finger. And then my other beloved art teacher, who I've been in contact with until recently, and he's still alive, but not very well. His name was Cavendish Morton III. He's a member of the Royal Academy, and he's a painter. Did a lot of watercolors, very realistic. I have some of his paintings.
So you're standing there next to the state of Texas. You want to tell us sort of how you came from England to Texas?
Well, in 1966, I met my husband. His parents were living in London, and they went on holiday to Portugal and met some of my parents' best friends who brought them back to Norfolk. And we met through them and had a summer romance, got married the following summer. And
So you must have been fairly young when you got married.
I was very young.
Yeah.
I just turned 19 when we got married. And we sailed over from Southampton to New York on the world's longest liner at the time, La France. And I'd never been to the States, so I got married and came to America without ever having been here previously. And I moved from
was
London.
your husband living in Texas then?
Richard was going to University of Houston.
Uh-huh.
But his family his stepfather and mother were oil business, and they lived in London, but he had stayed to finish high school and then went on to University of Houston. So that's how we ended up in Texas.
And what were you doing, other than being a new bride in Texas?
Well, before I got married, I'd finished high school equivalent and gone to the Institut Français in London. I thought I wanted to be an interpreter, French, English, and Spanish. And then I moved to Texas, and nobody speaks French, and that was my main language. So that didn't work out. And so when we first got married, I worked. Richard was finishing University of Houston, and I got a job as a receptionist for Family Life Insurance Company on the Katy Road. And they hired me because they liked my British accent. And most of their clients were African American, and everybody had very strong accents, and they could not understand me, and I couldn't understand them at all. It was quite hysterical. And I worked for a few other people in Houston. Then I worked for a while for a woman called Linda Pickle, who was a polio victim in the Texas Institute of Rehabilitation and Research. And she was the editor of a newspaper for the hospital, the Promethean. And I would take photos and help her with the articles.
So by this point, you were taking pictures?
Yeah, but not really seriously yet.
Well, then what was the purpose of the photos?
Just, to document. I wasn't really into it yet in photography. I would take photos for the newspaper, but I wasn't really doing anything on my own at that point in time.
Well, I think this takes us to one of your first photographs.
That is one of my first photographs. When we moved to Austin, Richard bought a camera, Nikon, and we signed up for a course with a guy called Harry Boyd, whose father is Boyd Camera here in town. But he was teaching a community course at the University of Texas, but just for the community. And it was an experimental photography course. I never took beginning photo. Don't know if any of my students are here, but and we would do all this black and white, developing film. We would set up a darkroom in a bedroom in the house that we were renting, And we would put negatives on turntables and sandwich them and put a light on them, and you'd get a line drawing and do solarization. So I kind of jumped in at the deep end experimenting with photography. But my first photographs, like this one, was really this was my Diane Arbus phase. I had seen her work, and it hit me like a ton of bricks. And I was really struck by her work because I thought, you know, at the time I think her photographs were really shocking.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think they are today for people because there have been more shocking images since then. But because of their strong psychological poignancy, I was really fascinated.
And
thought,
who is the subject here?
This is a woman who was a hoarder in a house in Dallas that we just stumbled across. Went into the house, and it was just completely full of things stacked
Now,
up.
how did you gain entrance into the house?
Just talked to her, and she said we could come in, and she had all these stories about things and where she'd got them, but there were just little paths going through the house and tons of furniture and who knows what. And I was very interested in kind of odd people like that. Still kind of am.
What kind of camera were you using at this time?
A Nikon F at the time, big heavy metal 35mm camera.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a zoom in and out, double exposure, and in camera of a skull that we owned at the time. And that was one of those, that was a high-key image from that time period, that class with Harry. And Harry went on to write a book called A Creative Approach to Photography, and he published a couple of my photos in that book.
So tell us a little more about how you got this strange effect where it looks more like a drawing or a painting than it does actually a photograph.
Actually took the negative and developed it. It was a Codolith negative, and developed it to eliminate the middle tones. So it's just a high key.
And were you working in a dark room yourself?
Yeah, at home.
Mm-hmm. And who are the subjects?
Again, these were actually also at the same time I took that photograph of the woman in the house. These were just children that were sitting by this vacant lot in Dallas. And they looked, you know, so abandoned. And I'm always drawn to subjects that have some kind of emotion.
Mm-hmm.
Again, I think that's probably still the influence of Arbus. And then the photograph on the left was done later. I was actually in college here in San Antonio.
In San Antonio, where were you attending?
At University of Texas in San Antonio, and
were you studying photography?
I had started at UT Austin. And when I'd fallen in love with photography with that first class, I thought this is what I want to do because it's something that I can always do and that I'll never get tired of. And I think that's really true. You can never know it all. And there's always something else to learn or some other subject to explore. And at this time, I was taking a view camera class, my first view camera class. And so that's from a 4x5 view camera, both of those are. And the one on the left, I had these dried peppers, and we had these old theater seats that had a tear in them, and I just arranged the peppers on that chair. So it was one of the first still lifes that I did.
Now, you did a whole series, though, on the Alameda Theater, is that correct?
I did a whole series on the Alameda Theater.
And what led you to the Alameda?
Again, I've always been interested in places that have a sense of time in the past. And I'd also, around that time, I'd also been photographing old diners and funky motels with the view camera. And but I think this was probably before those. And I love Art Deco, and I used to work downtown. I was actually also working part-time for some lawyers in town. And I would go out at my lunch hour and wander around, and I found the Alameda and asked if I could go inside and take photos, and they let me in between or before any of the movies that they were still
So it was still
running.
functioning as a movie theater.
It was in its last years of functioning as a movie theater, and it was running kind of B-grade Spanish language movies. And those are also the Alameda.
And what are we looking at specifically there?
Upstairs on the left is the balcony shot. Probably one of the hardest black and white prints I've ever printed, because it required a lot of burning and dodging because it had that strange lighting. And then on the right is a downstairs shot of 2 movie posters that were up.
Did you go there repeatedly, or did you do this
I
all?
went there
yeah,
repeatedly.
you did?
Yeah.
Okay. Now, these are the first color images we're looking at. So you're working with
Hand coloring.
hand coloring.
Yeah. We moved to St. Louis for a couple of years, and I took a class and learned how to hand color. And I had also been going back, and whenever I went home, I had begun to photograph along the coast of Norfolk, where I come from, and I still do. I still work on that series, probably always will. And I was thinking about the idea of the funky picture postcards that are often hand-colored from the beach, and you find them in England. And so took these photographs. These are 35 millimeter black and white negatives. Photographed them in England, came back to Texas, developed them and printed them and hand-colored them.
And what were you using to actually apply the color?
At that time, I was printing on my favorite paper, Agfa Portriga Rapid 118 surface, which they don't make anymore. I
was just going to say, can you still get it?
Can't get it anymore. And I use Marshall oil, which you spread on you dampen the paper with an oil and turpentine solution called Marshall's PM solution. And then any kind of oil-based pencils, you can draw on the image, and you can smooth it over almost like a wash of watercolor, so the image still comes through that, or you can also draw it on very thickly.
Did it always work, or did you find you had to sometimes use the same print more than once to get it right?
It always worked for me. I grew up painting and drawing in school in England, and so I think I've always liked having a hand in there too. So a lot of my work is very process and hand oriented until recently, I would say.
Until digital technology came along.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's another one from that series and from that time period.
Now, I've noticed that in some of these recent photographs we're looking at, you're attracted to signage.
I do like signs, yeah.
Yeah.
I've always liked signs, like Walker Evans.
Yes, I was going to ask you.
Yeah, and I like his work too. And I'm always attracted to funky places that have a sense of history, and also I think some of my work has some humor or irony in it. Like, I just thought that was funny, El Fandango, and there's a car parked there and it's got a flat tire and it just looks so funky.
Is that place still around?
I don't know. It's somewhere here in San Antonio, and I actually don't remember exactly where it was.
Should Google it.
Should look and see if it's still around and go back and re-photograph it.
That would be interesting, yeah. And what's the locale there?
Venice
Beach,
Venice
California?
Beach, yeah, California. Just love that shadow.
And what's that a shadow from?
It's a shadow from a pier and there was a little balcony on it. It was on the beach, and I've always liked to, on those beach photographs, I think there's a lot of distance in the work, and these isolated people in the landscape.
Do you feel you're influenced by movies at all and some of the perspectives, you know, some of the way you frame what you're looking at?
I haven't thought about that, but I do watch a lot of movies.
Yeah, I mean, because it reminds me of a shot you might see in a movie.
And my eldest son is a cinematographer, so. But I've always watched a lot of movies, so possibly, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And then these are also view camera work. This is from the Funky Motel series.
And you're thinking of the picture postcard tradition
I was
again?
still thinking of the picture postcard tradition and the slightly off colors that are not realistic and a bit skewed, which you can do. So you have that control when you're hand coloring. And I would take my view camera and photograph all these motels, and it was always very interesting. The Tidelands in Houston, they loved it. They were like, this is great publicity. And but some places I got chased out of. Some motels weren't so happy about being photographed. I was actually asked if I was a health inspector a couple of times.
And now a complete shift.
Complete shift.
Where were you going? Why did you change?
I had I had been photographing the motel series, and I became pregnant with my second child. And it was just impossible to take a baby, a view camera that weighed about 40 pounds, you know, around to funky motels and take photographs. So, and I was tied more to the house with the baby. And so I had to find a way to make work at home. And I began to set up these still life. And nature in the garden have also been another thing that have always run through my work.
Do you garden?
I do garden. I'm a big English gardener in Texas. I grow roses and vines.
And you photographed your own?
And I photographed my own flowers. And in the first ones, you know, I was simply, the one on the left, the bird of paradise, was simply thinking about filling the space in an interesting way. We had an old snooker table and a room with windows that went around on 3 sides. I'd just lay things on mat board on the snooker table and set up my view camera and photograph them. Then we had darkroom in the back. And then they began to get more complicated, and I began to gather things like some of the dead insects. And I also was looking at hieroglyphs and using the structure of the hieroglyph to set up the still life in the one on the right, Spring Symphony. So it's very loosely based on hieroglyphs, and I think of them as pictorial language that speaks to the senses.
Okay.
And these are same kind of idea, still using the form of the hieroglyph loosely, but I was also with these are all done still with a view camera, but these are double or triple prints depending on the image.
What do you mean by double or triple prints?
Well, the one on the left, the black area is a photogram, which is where you take a piece of photographic paper and you place things directly on the paper and you expose them to light, so there's no negative. And I was making a mat, and then the middle white area is from a negative. But there's actually 3 separate exposures on one piece of paper, on the one on the left, and the one on, and 2 on the, no, actually 3 on the one on the right too. Because the negative area has to be exposed separately because it's a different exposure in the dark room, and then covered up, and then the black area had to be exposed separately. And then actually I enlarged those cicada wings at the top, so they were a 3rd exposure.
So when you're exposing different parts of the composition separately, do you have to cover other areas of the composition, like when painters will tape off areas?
Yeah. I just would cut up mat board in the shape that I wanted it, you know, and of course you have to pre-visualize what you want and make my...
Did you make drawings to do that?
Sometimes I